if the ego self is not real, why does it feel so real? How come it is that we feel like there's a center of us, a center to whom experiences are happening? This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and today we get to talk about how the ego disguises itself in a very clever way. In order to explain how this happens and what's really going on, it's good to revisit some of the basics about how the ego comes about in the first place. And as I've described in previous videos, it all begins in very early childhood, in which we, first of all, split ourselves into subject and object. So there's a split in our minds that happens very early on. And when that split takes place, we start to go out there in the world and, as toddlers, realize that we are actually incredibly vulnerable. And it makes it very unpalatable for the mind to be inhabiting the body in a world that is so foreign and so uncontrollable for a toddler. So we start to cut ourselves off from a lot of places in our body that feel uncomfortable and scary. And we depart away from those places and into our heads. By the time we are adults, we not only have split ourselves into subject and object, but we have surrounded ourselves by a whole matrix of object relations in our head that make up for our view of the world. And the view of the world has become the reality. So we are no longer in touch with what's actually going on. And the other thing that has happened is that the egoic self has completely hijacked our identity. Now, the egoic self is nothing but the departure from the body. So you come to realize this as you start to practice the technique of self-inquiry. So the technique that Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj spoke about, in which you orient your attention to investigate what you mean when you say I. All this time, you've been assuming that there is a certain self to whom experiences are happening. But when you start to look for that self, you can't find it. What you start to find is a lot of uncomfortable feelings that you have been reluctant to feel. So every time you look for the self, what you find is pain instead of a certain individual that seems to live behind your eyes to whom things are happening. And when you've done this enough times, a certain pattern starts to emerge. And you come to realize not only that you have many selves, or that the ego is a many-headed monster, but that all these supposed selves are not really you, nor are they a self really, but they are points of departure away from something that you were not willing to feel at some point because you didn't have the mental capacity to sustain those sensations or those emotions. So once again, the mechanism of departure away from unwanted sensations appears to be a self, but really it's just a departure from the sensations. And logically, it would feel like there's a center to it, because when everything is interconnected, there is no center. It's just an organism doing its thing. But when things are disconnected, the point of disconnection is like a stopping point. Sensations and perceptions don't go past that point. So, for example, if At some point, I disconnected myself from my throat plexus. There's a nervous plexus here with a lot of connections and things going on. Some literature is called the chakras. Let's call it a nervous plexus for the sake of the conversation. Now, if I disconnect myself from it, sensations are not going through. There's a point here that is disconnected, and I can feel only up to that point. I'm making it very physical in my explanation. But that stoppage point of sensation feels like a point from which things are being felt. So you can't feel through it, and therefore it feels like a center. So that whenever you feel a certain fear related to the center over here, it feels like it's happening to a certain you. There's a certain from which is being felt. That from is the very disconnection that has been created in the psychosomatics. I'm painting this in a very literal way, and I'm sure that on a neurological level is a little bit more nuanced and a bit more rich than that. But the main point that I want to communicate is that the many selves that the ego is made up of are not really selves. They are just departure from discomfort. It's a fearful departure away from things that we are not willing to feel. If you look for the center of yourself, you will find fear of discomfort. And then when you look past the fear, you find the discomfort itself. But what you never get to find is a self that is feeling it all. So the ego is fear of sensations disguised as yourself. And this can be understood theoretically. But if you want to be free of the fear of sensations and therefore free of the fear of fear, the only way to do that is to show your mind time and again that whenever a certain self arises saying, I have a problem with so-and-so, or I have a blockage with this situation, or there's something in my life that needs to be different so that I can feel okay with myself, all these stories, you want to ask, who is it that thinks that? And if you look for that who, what you will find is discomfort that you were unwilling to feel. There is no who behind it. There is just the reluctance to feel discomfort. The ego is reluctance to feel, or you could say it is the fear of fear. That's what it actually is, but it disguises itself as a certain center that feels like the center of yourself. There is no such thing, and hence the Buddhist notion of no self, anatta, which starts to be experienced more and more the more you dissolve these little selves by reconnecting with sensations in the body that you escaped away from at some point or another. And the more of them you eliminate, the more connected you become. And not only does the sense of a self, or the sense of a center behind your eyes especially, starts to disappear, but that inner connection starts to result also in a sense of outer connection, because everything that is the bubble of perception that you're in is your bubble of perception, is made up of your own mind, or at least rendered by your own mind. I'm not going to go as far as to say that the world doesn't exist, but you could certainly make the case that everything you think you see is a projection of your mind based on the circumstances in the quantum soup, or whatever you want to call it, right? So it's a rendering of your own mind that you are immersed in. And that starts to become very apparent. That's one of the reasons why the more non-dual you become, the more these realizations start to arise. Everything starts to look like a wakeful dream, because it is kind of a mental projection, just like a dream is a mental projection. It's just a different kind of mental projection. It is longer lived. So whilst the dream might be, you dream for 8 hours every night, and your wakeful life is more like 80 years, but the substance of it is purely made of mind as well. What is it triggered by? We don't know. The ultimate reality is God knows what. And now I digress. The main point of the video was to make you privy to the fact that that which feels like you is your ego, and it is a disguise. So self is the ego's disguise, and what it's trying to hide from you is the fact that you're using it as a mechanism to not feel things that are essentially uncomfortable. I am very curious about your take on this video, so do share your questions and comments in the comment section. And as usual, if you think that these are videos that other people would benefit from, then your liking, your sharing, and subscribing makes the channel more available to others. It's also very motivating to me. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Until then, cheerio. Bye-bye.